Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Black in Genetics Week Career Day. Today, we are here with Dr. Melissa B. Davis, and we're going to talk to her a little bit about her career story, how she got to where she is, and some of her perspectives and what she's doing in the lab. So, thank you for joining us today, Dr. Davis.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
To get us started, I just wanted to begin with some like very basic information about your background and where you currently are, and then we'll get into some details about how you actually became big and what your career story is. So to get us started, what are you currently doing? So like, what are your titles, and where are you?
All right. My titles. So I have a few titles now. I'm currently, my primary institution is Morehouse School of Medicine in Atlanta, Georgia, where I am the inaugural director of the Institute for Translational Genomic Medicine. I'm also a professor in microbiology, biochemistry, and immunology. I'm also a distinguished investigator with the Georgia Research Alliance. And I held on to a few of my titles after I left Weill Cornell, which was my immediate past institution. There, I am an associate professor in the Department of Surgery, and I play a role in the Englander Institute for Precision Medicine for their health equity program. I was director then, but sort of interim now. And I am a cancer ethnicity scholar at the New York Genome Center, and that facilitates a lot of the genomics work that I do. And then I guess my last title, oh yes, one of the most important ones. I'm scientific director of the center, the International Center for the Study of Breast Cancer Subtypes. So that's ICSBCS. It was founded by Dr. Lisa Newman, who is my research partner at Weill Cornell. She's a breast surgeon.
Lovely, thank you. So, I heard a lot of different departments and your titles and things. So, in general, what does your group currently study?
Okay. So my personal lab is studying cancer disparities broadly under that umbrella. We focus mainly on breast cancer. By sort of purpose, we study triple negative breast cancer because that's one of the drivers of disparities and mortality in African American women. I'm focused on the African American population, I'll say that. Um, and we also study prostate cancer. My first paper was actually in a prostate cancer study. My first paper for human genetics, I should say, was in a prostate cancer comparative study between white and black men. But we also study genetic ancestry. So we utilize special tools of genomics to really try and unravel why we see these differences in tumor biology. So I'm a molecular geneticist by training, a genomicist also, I guess you could say. But I'm really focused on the biology of things. And more recently, I would say, because some of the signals we were detecting when we made these comparisons between populations didn't appear to be as connected to the genetic background, but were clearly associated with groups, right? Um, when we looked at what those particular pathways were, they seemed to be related to comorbidities that were more prevalent in certain populations. And so now our research kind of pivots a bit on the axis of looking at external um, influences on the genetic networks. So, thinking about it from an environmental perspective, if we think about groups across populations, especially that we can detect on a global scale, that's going to be something socially related to the groupings, right? So now we're interested in social determinants of health. Um, but because I'm also the director of the Institute, we are helping some of the faculty at Morehouse study other aspects of disparities because mainly the research that comes from Morehouse School of Medicine is going to be hinged upon some aspect of the community and some disparity. So we are helping with some maternal health um, studies, some neuroscience studies. So, yeah, we're growing in respect to the broad aspects of genetics and disparities, but primarily I study breast cancer disparities.
Wonderful. So, we're definitely going to come back to your research and some of the topics that you discussed or you touched on briefly. But I want to get into some details about your career journey, and it's career day today. So, we want to know exactly how you became big. And to that end, our first question is pretty basic, just like about where you attended school and then where you did your postdoc training. And then while you're telling us where those places are, just like briefly what area you were in when you studied.
So I started my undergrad was at Albany State University. It was Albany State College actually at the time in Albany, Georgia. It's a historically black college. I studied biology, probably natural sciences or something like that, something very broad. I went on to graduate school for a year at the Ohio State University, but I finished up my PhD at University of Georgia, where I studied molecular genetics. From there, I did a postdoc at Yale School of Medicine for functional genomics. I went from Yale to University of Chicago, where our functional genomics kind of pivoted into systems biology. And that's also where I started studying cancer disparities at the University of Chicago's Center for Interdisciplinary Health Disparities. Um, let's see, what else can I say? Well,
Where
I'll,
you
I'll
so
tell
you
you.
got yeah.
I'll tell you that my inspiration to move into these different places was, I don't know, kind of driven by what I was seeing in the community. So I ended up majoring in genetics by way of a summer program from Albany State. And I spent some time doing some basic science research. And in that program, we had to read some primary papers. And I just chose genetics randomly as my topic. And the paper that I read was about a gene that was discovered for criminal behavior. And the scientists in that paper reported that they identified this variant primarily in the African American portion of their cohort. And that troubled me greatly. And what was even more troubling was that I couldn't really understand what the study was. Like, what did they actually do? Like, what were the procedures? How do you find a gene for criminal behavior to start with? You know, what is this about? And so as I started digging deeper, I just decided I wanted to understand what this was because I needed to be able to um, be informed if I'm going to fight against some genetic test that's going to say that I am predisposed to criminal behavior, right? Or my children, or my cousins, or my brothers, you know. And from there, I was just trying to get more understanding about genetics. I ended up thinking about cancer when I got to University of Chicago. My postdoc advisor um, assigned me the task of helping Dr. Fumio Lapade's lab with some of their analyses. And I just was struck by what I heard in terms of the mortality differences in Black and white populations. And I decided, well, that's going to be what I want to focus on because it seemed like something people were ignoring. It just wasn't important enough to the people who had the power to do something about it. So I'm sorry.
Bless you.
Tried to
No
hold it.
problem. Oh no problem. Bless you.
Yeah, so that's how I became big.
Incredible. I think that you actually touched on some of my questions. Was was this random, decision to read a genetics paper what prompted you to study genomics?
Yeah, I mean it's interesting. We just had an assignment. You know, our instructor just wanted us to have exposure to primary literature, and it just was by
Hmm.
chance that I chose this genetics paper. I think the title was probably something catchy. I should find it. I really should because it was a pivotal moment. But I also at the time thought it was trash.
Yeah,
so
right, right.
so I
I mean,
did
it
not.
sounds like a good, yeah,
Yeah, and I mean
it
since
sounds like a good
then,
example.
I remember trying to keep track of what was going to come of the study. But there were several papers that came out after refuting sort of the application of that data, to such a broad implication. And, so I felt safer, but I also thought, wow, who regulates such things? And apparently no one. It's kind of just the society of scientists and academics regulating one another. And I thought we needed more voices, we needed more representation, because there would never have been a study that would attribute criminal behavior to an entire race of people if the study had involved people as scientists, as investigators who were stakeholders in that group, right? So I just took it upon myself to try and represent, our community.
And this yeah, this stakeholdership and actually being invested in these communities, I feel like that's exactly what is kind of missing from a lot of these conversations that we have about like why representation is so important. It is about all of these other reasons that we're talking about, and having it including the community, but including the community is because we need to have people who have genuine passion and do have stake in these communities. Like,
And
I think
understand it.
that
Yeah, I
part,
mean,
yeah,
yeah.
right,
You
right,
need to
right,
understand the people that you're studying. You
yes,
can't study a culture of people through a telescope and then think that
mm-hmm,
you are somehow more informed about the life that they live than they are, or that you
exactly,
are discovering something on their behalf. And
yeah,
I think that's a real problem. But more than that, I think that the study was what it was, the data was what it was. There are differences across these populations. There are differences that could potentially be leading to a unique perspective, a unique trajectory in the plasticity of many different types of diseases. And I think that's something we need to capture, we need to understand, but we need to be careful, right, about how
yes,
we interpret it, how we deliver that information, because if we're
yes,
just haphazardly making assumptions or making associations, right, then it becomes problematic. Then it becomes even more of a burden, to an already overburdened society. And I think that it just takes the effort, and that's
mhm,
really the bottom line, that it's an extra step, it's an extra amount of effort. I love to see allies, in the space trying to help us
yeah,
solve problems. But you can't do that from afar. You actually have to be
mhm,
committed to doing the work. It's not
exactly.
it's not the type of work that one should do from afar. And I think that has to be much more ingrained in our training as well. I mean, when you think about population genetics, I studied in a department where we were split by population versus molecular genetics, and our population colleagues would often have to go into the field, right? They had to go out and
Mhm.
capture whatever they were studying. They had to grow the plants. They had to go get the fruit flies or the shellfish or whatever. They have to actually go in the environment to understand the environment. And I think that people who study human populations should be held to that same level of rigor. I mean, you cannot try and study something that's so integrated with everyday lived experiences and not really understand what those experiences are. So, and I'm going to get off my soapbox because I could talk about that for hours.
You know what? I think that this space is exactly your soapbox. Please make it that, because I want to hear all of these things that you have to say and shout it to the world as much as I can help do that.
Wonderful.
So so our next question is, during your career, have you ever had moments of uncertainty? And if so, how did you deal with them?
Oh, certainly. I think, I said recently to someone that I felt that every big accomplishment I've made in my life has been coupled to some form of heartache or stress. Every step of my career, I've had some uncertainty, mainly because it's a pioneering road. When you are doing something that is not only unlike what others are doing around you, but they don't necessarily think you should or that you should, you know. It should be done. They don't think it should be done, but certainly they don't think you are a good fit for whatever the role is. It's always difficult. When you're the first, when you're the only, you're going to be met with opposition. Some of it will be blatant, some of it will be very subtle. And there were times when, I doubted my science, but then I'm supposed to. As a scientist, that's part of the scientific method, right? We think about what we observe and then we ask questions and we interrogate. And I just had to remember that, maybe I'm wrong, but we're going to do the experiment, right? Like that's why we're here. We're all here to do experiments. We're here to do science and collect the data so that we can build on a solid foundation of information. So, I mean, there was a time when I was about to quit my job and teach high school. I remember I had gone and interviewed. It was going to be at the Natural History Museum in Atlanta. This was my first faculty appointment. It was just so stressful. I was a young mom at the time, and I talked myself into it. I was like, "It's going to be great. There's a dinosaur in the lobby I get to see every day, and there's a planetarium over across the yard. I can go watch the stars for lunch. It'll be great for the kids to come and play." Like I had just talked myself into it, and I just could not bring myself to sign the contract. And then there have been times when some of the giants around me have tried to silence me because I was going against whatever the current agenda might have been for the institution or the field or whatever. Like there's always going to be a bit of turmoil that one has to get through. But I would say the reason why I kept going is because, well, my children were watching all the time, and I didn't want to teach them to give up. So I said, well, we're going to keep the fight until we can't fight anymore. And I had allies, I had friends, I had collaborators, people who were going through similar scenarios. When you're in isolation, it feels like an insurmountable task to overcome. That's why a support network is important. And it doesn't necessarily have to be people who are physically around you every day. It could be colleagues across the world or the country or at another institution just down the street. But you need to find a set of colleagues who share your insights, who are on a similar path, not necessarily collaborating on every single experiment that you do, but in their own field, in their own right, they are having conversations that are antithetical to the leaders in the field, but they have solid evidence, to support them. But because we are who we are, it makes people very uncomfortable. If a field has been going in a certain direction for decades, and then me, my black woman self, comes in and says, well, actually, you're missing 95% of the information that you need. Well, who am I? Who are you? We know what we're doing. You don't know what you're talking about. And I think that that's something that hopefully the work that we've done um, has opened some doors for your generation, for the people who are coming behind us, so that you don't have to struggle as much as we had to struggle. And I think that's true of the people who came before me. So that's also a reason why I kept going, because I thought about the people behind me. I thought about my students, you know, and well, I'm a spiritual person. I felt like this wasn't necessarily my choice either. I felt like this was part of my calling. So here I am, and we'll see how it ends. We'll see how it ends.
Amazing. So, if you were to have a conversation with your graduate student self, do you think they would be surprised to see where you are now?
I'm thinking, so in my little townhouse, I knock on the door and it's me, and I say, "Hey, guess what we're doing now?" I'm like, "Oh wow!" I don't think I would be surprised. I would be happy, like, "Oh wow, so we did it," like, yeah, because right now I'm struggling, you know. I'm wondering if I made a mistake. So yeah, that's what's up. I think that's what I would say. That's what's up.
That's what's
Um,
up. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah.
And would you give them any advice? Is there anything important you would tell them?
You were right about the third band on the Northern. You were right. You were right. Don't give up. That was drama in my lab. That was like, oh my gosh, it was just the source of so many sleepless nights, so many unneeded experiments. Like you were right. You were right. But no, I think that I would probably tell myself to have more faith. Not to give in to naysayers. Stand up for yourself. I only started doing that after my postdoc. I don't think I stood up for myself as much as I could, because I believed them. My imposter syndrome was very much aflame, I would say, in a lot of situations, and so I would tell myself that you belong in that space, and you're going to do some great work. You just have to push past the negative people and find the positive people. Yeah. And I would tell myself to spend more time with my mom. She was very wise, and I wish I had spent more time with her for sure.
Amazing. Okay, so I want to pivot a little bit and talk about your thoughts, your research, and where you currently are. Um, so with the idea of ancestry in mind, first of all, we love the use of ancestry in your research. I have actually referred people to some of your papers as a good example of how to use ancestry in research. So from your position and with your knowledge, could you please tell our audience a little bit about ancestry, how it's different from race, and then why that's so important in medical studies
Sure,
and
yeah.
genetics.
So genetic ancestry is your genes, your lineage, right? It tells you who your ancestors are in a broad sense. Of course, we all were from the same lineage, but from a more recent sense, it tells us um, about our history as well, in terms of our experience, where we are, and how we came to be, how your family came to be. And I think that the information that we can gather from ancestry um, is very powerful when you think about the way we capture information, especially for science, for research studies, isn't always accurate. It's very clumsily collected. It's very stochastic, even. Like it could be someone telling us who they are, or someone having to choose from a very limited set of boxes, or someone being looked at by a complete stranger and them deciding who and what you are. And then we capture that information and we use it as though it's sound, and it's not. But your genes are, like, your DNA is what it is, and it may hold information that you didn't even know about yourself or your lineage. And so because it's the blueprint of how our cells behave, react, how we grow, I think that's what we should focus on when we're talking about differences across populations and how our genes are being expressed. Like, that should always be the first step, understanding what the actual gene variants are. ancestry for now is just the best way to try and demarcate the background of the genetics that we study just by virtue of the global geography and how where populations live has an influence on the gene variants in that population, right? So that's how we know ancestry. Those gene variants arose and were fixed in the areas they were because they conferred something that was beneficial. And that benefit is a physiology to that particular group of people. Now, on the flip side of that coin is race, where these were constructs that were designed to marginalize specific people of certain lineage, though, right? So, but clumsily so as well. It was made mainly sort of colonialism, at its finest, classism at its finest, having a juxtaposition to whiteness. If you're not white, then you're something else, and that's really all race is. It's if you're not white, then you're black. You're either white or black. And then it's like, oh, okay, well, the Native Americans are here, so let's add that to the census tract, right? Or, okay, well, we got some Asians here, people from Asia. Where's Asia? Okay, great. So now we have another box. So it's all very clumsy, and it's only designed for political reasons. It's only designed for social constructs. But because it was designed, it's also a tool for something that's used in society. That tool is to marginalize these groups of people. It helps the political powers that be determine where you live, what resources you're allowed access to. And unfortunately, that also then translates to a lack of them, right? You have a lack of resources if you are outside of a certain group where most of the resources are poured in. And we don't necessarily, we, the proverbial we, in terms of the powers that be, we don't always get the attention that's necessary to keep an environment that's healthy for these groups of people that are in these socially constructed boxes, right? So if you're on a certain side of town that's a red zone, then your infrastructure on that side of town is probably very poor. Your roads, your air quality, your water quality, your accessibility to food, is very different in that part of town than the green part of town where privileged white individuals were encouraged to live. On that side of town, your roads are paved once a year. You have a lot of the resources that are allocated in your school system. You have a flourishing supermarket that's always got fresh fruits and vegetables. And so then we see this juxtaposition of a marginalized, minoritized group that are annotated by this race construct, but then they also happen to be of a certain genetic lineage. By definition, that's why they were placed in this marginalized group. And so you have these correlations that need to be teased apart, right? Some of it is because of our lineage, right, of our ancestors, but a lot of it is because of the environment that we are forced to live in. And so what our work is trying to get towards, right? We were able to find some really striking things when we use genetic ancestry. I think of it as even as a filter, right? So I'm using genetic ancestry as a filter. If we just look at two different populations and we ask what are the differences in their gene expression, we're going to find a lot of things that are different. But what part of that difference is because of our genetics, and what part of that difference is because of our environment, right? Basic science, genetics 101, gene by environment. But the environment isn't even well defined. We know it's different. It's defined in our experiences, but it's not defined in a scientifically quantified way to actually help us discern well, what part of these differences is actually from something very specific in the environment? Is it the stress in the environment? Is it the air pollution in the environment? Is it a lack of vitamins? Is it some toxin? What is it about the environment that's causing these differences in the way our genes are behaving? And even more importantly, in that environment, if you had a different genetic background in that environment, would those same genes behave in the same way? And so we have to do that dandelion experiment, right? Where you grow the dandelion in the lab, you grow the dandelion on a sunny side of the hill, on a shady side of the hill, and you ask the question, what part of this is genetics? What part of this is the environment? And when we know, then we can start to actually intervene and do something about whatever the burdens are physiologically, whatever the burdens are: high blood pressure, hypertension, anemia, predisposition to very aggressive cancers, autoimmune disorders. Once we really understand the drivers of these different comorbidities, then we can start to truly intervene. Right now, it's a very broad intervention. You need to eat better, you need to exercise, but what is it really that's driving those things? And I think that, ancestry is just a tool for now. Once we actually understand what the gene variants are, then ancestry won't necessarily even need to be something that we measure. We're just looking for individual gene variants, and we should already be there, right? If we had studied the global population in its totality when we were doing all these GWAS studies, then we would already know and we wouldn't need to. But again, ancestry right now is just the demarcating thing, right? The demarcating factor that allows me to say that your genetic background is X or Y or Z. It was West African, or it's East African, or it's South Asian, or it's Polynesian, or like that allows me to at least start in blocks to identify what it is about a certain group of people. But we really want to get down to an N of one. Like, what is it about you? Because when you think about the admixed populations, right, they're changing every generation, right? So it won't matter, 10 years from now that we just created this, well, 100 years, I should say, or 200 years, that we created a way of discerning genetic ancestry, because hopefully it won't matter because your ancestry is so stochastically distributed across your chromosomes that I really just want to know if you have this particular variant, because that 1% of European ancestry could have that particular variant that I'm looking for, that we need to know about in order to intervene and make sure that you're aware, right, that you should avoid certain things, or that you can't have a certain type of therapeutic for certain types of diseases, right? And it doesn't really matter what you call yourself. I don't care, if you say that you're white or you say that you're Hispanic. I just care that you have this gene variant. It'll be interesting to know that the history of the gene variant is that it arose in Ireland, 500 years ago for whatever reason. But it doesn't really matter for the science. Yeah, so I probably said more than you needed, but
That was
yeah, answer.
absolutely perfect. No, that was absolutely perfect. You touched on other questions that I sort of had, and yeah, so I actually think that we can even end there. That was wonderful.
All right.
So thank you very much again for joining us for our big career day,
Thank you.
and yeah, we will see you online.
All right. Thanks so much. It's nice to meet you.
Thank you.